Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Sinai Temple. Anybody here for the first time? Nice. Okay, well, welcome. I'm Rabbi Erez Sherman, the co-senior rabbi of Sinai Temple, and we're really honored to have you here and host this very special event. I saw that most of you already have the book in your hands. If you don't, you can make sure that you get the book outside, Zev Los Angeles, a political memoir from Boyle Heights to the Halls of Power. As I was just telling Zev that I did not grow up here in Los Angeles, and so to read this book as somebody who is not a native was really fascinating to hear the history of what I walked into only 15 years ago, and where I am bringing up my own family and now leading a congregation in the county that you serve so well. Also a fellow board member of LA Hebrew High, so thank you for all that you have done and continue to do for the generations of young Jews here in Los Angeles and also around the world. And so a quick bio for those of you who are not familiar with Zev Yaroslavsky and this book. The book, Zev Los Angeles, a story of Zev Yaroslavsky, son of Ukrainian Jews, so we'll get into that a little later as well, who immigrated to the United States 100 years ago. Fiercely independent, he combined an activist passion with a seasoned politician's skill to challenge the region's power brokers. He fought to free Soviet Jews in the 70s, led the effort to ban local taxes from funding the 1984 Olympics. Looking forward to asking you about the 2028 Olympics. Teamed with President Clinton to avoid a catastrophic county bankruptcy. Helped develop LA's modern transit system. Also have a couple of questions about the subway later. Won a bruising battle with the real estate interests to save the Santa Monica Mountains from rapacious development. Was pivotal in the development of Walt Disney Concert Hall and the modernization of the iconic Hollywood Bowl. And we are honored that Zev Yaroslavsky joins us to begin to tell his story. We'll do a little question and answer after, and then open it up to discussion as well. It's not streamed, it is recorded that we'll send to our community after this evening. And so without further ado, our honored and distinguished guest, Zev Yaroslavsky.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you to the Sinai Temple community. My good friends Bill and Anna Tenenblatt, who go back not 100 years, but about half that. And it didn't occur to me that my mother and grandparents came here 100 years ago. October 1st, it'll be 100 years since they took that boat trip. So thank you again for hosting this, and I will sign anybody's book if you want me to sign it before any. I'll stay here until you all have a signed book. I believe in signing anybody's book or autograph. Ever since I was 14 years old, when I saw some young kid who was 8 years old trying to get the autograph from Mickey Mantle when they were playing the Dodgers in the 1963 World Series, and Mickey Mantle sniped at him and said, "No, I won't sign your autograph book." And then he went in, and I said, "That's a terrible thing to do to an 8-year-old kid." So I vowed at that time, if I ever have to sign an autograph, I'll sign anybody's autograph. So, but first of all, I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and the rabbi has done his homework. He's read the book, and I'm in trouble. And the substance of the book we'll get into in his questions and answers. Let me tell you why I wrote the book and how long it took me. It was almost a 7.5 year project. When I left office in 2014, at the end of 2014, I was asked, "What are you going to do now that you're retired?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to teach, and I want to write a memoir." And sure enough, UCLA came knocking at my door, my alma mater, and offered me an opportunity not only to teach LA history and public policy, but also to do some projects and advise the chancellor on some Israel-Palestine issues on campus, which, as you know, these can get pretty dicey very quickly. And I thought I was going to have an easy time, but it's been a full-time job, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. So the reason I wrote the book is for three reasons. I got my master's in British Empire history. They asked me, what good did that do? My father tried to convince me, my father, who was a history teacher, and somebody here was my father's student, was it Ralph? And I was my father's student too. I had a harder time than you did because the school didn't end at 6 o'clock. It was just starting. But my dad was a history teacher, and he told me don't if you're going to study history, get a PhD in history, don't do British Empire. You'll never get a job. Nobody cares about the British Empire anymore. And he was right. Of course, I thought he was wrong at the time. It took me about 15 months to figure out he was right. But I was trained in history, and I do believe that people who, in whatever walk of life they are, whether it's politics or whether it's in business or whether it's in nonprofit, community service, if they have a story to tell, they really have an obligation to tell it in some fashion. Not everybody can write a book or have the time to do it or the discipline to do it, but I wanted to write a memoir because it's a history, and I was part of that history, and I wanted to tell my side of that story. This is not an advocacy book, but I was in the room where a lot of things happened, and I wanted to share that with you and with future historians, future students who otherwise would not have it. I tried to convince one of my predecessors, Roz Wyman, who was councilwoman, still holds the record for the youngest councilwoman ever to serve in Los Angeles at the age of 22. She was very responsible for bringing the Dodgers from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. And I begged her to write a memoir. I said, if you don't, you'll go to your grave with those stories. I tried to convince Vince Scully, the broadcaster of the Dodgers, to write a memoir. I mean, he had more stories than you could put in a book. He didn't want to do it, and now he's gone. So I wasn't going to waste my time thinking about it, and I started working on it 2 or 3 years after I left office. That was one reason. Second reason is I wanted to tell my story, my story. It's not just a history. This is a memoir, but it's nested in the history of L.A. during that same period. So the rabbi comes from Syracuse, New York. When he reads the memoir, it's not a vanity project he's reading. It's a lot about what I did and my upbringing and all, but it's also a period piece about Los Angeles, how what it was like before I was born, while I was growing up, how it's changed, and finally, I wanted it to be I've done some controversial things in my career, and I've been I started at the age of 26 as a public official, and I retired when I was 66. So there are people who weren't even born when halfway through my career who are now writing revisionist histories about things that I was involved in. And I'm not going to get into an argument with them, but I want to make sure that my side of the story is in print, and people can take it or leave it. And I'm pretty sure in most of those cases, again, I don't do this as a vanity project. I do it with the rigor of a graduate student in history, going through just with sources on every single fact that I assert, and every single fact in that book is backed up. I didn't put it in the book because it would be a bigger book than the book itself, the footnotes. But if anybody has a question about where did you get that number, we have it. So those were the reasons I wrote it. I didn't think it would take 7 years to do it. And it was a very not difficult, it was a rigorous experience. We wrote it. I wrote it with a co-author, Josh Gitlin, who used to write for the LA Times, used to be their New York Times correspondent, bureau chief. His wife was actually my press secretary for 2 years in the early 80s. And he went to Fairfax High School. He was a year behind me. He knew politics. He was a press secretary for George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, when Moscone was assassinated back in the 70s, late 70s. And so he knew politics. He knew the neighborhood in which I grew up. He knew me. He knew the whole gestalt. And so between the two of us, it was a great collaboration. The hard part was writing the book in my voice. He couldn't write the book in my voice, but he wrote the book, the first draft of the book, the architecture of the book, and then we worked together to rewrite it or to modify it in my voice. Only I can talk about how I felt when my mother died at the age of 10. He couldn't put himself in my shoes because he's not me. And so it was a really great collaboration. He's a great writer, and he made me an even better writer. And over the period of time, we edited it. I have dozens and dozens of edits of this book, and I had a lot of help from people who knew how to edit books, and it turned out all right. I'm the son of Jews from Ukraine. My mother was born in Poltava. My father was born in Belyatserkov. Both cities have been bombed by the Russians in the last year and a half. My grandfather on my mother's side was a Soloveitchik, Shimon Soloveitchik. As far as we know, all the Soloveitchiks are distantly related, although we have no connection with the rabbinical family, the famous Soloveitchik rabbinical family. But we all come from a little town. Ancestors come from a little town in the southwest part of Belarus. I visited my grandfather's birthplace, a little hamlet in the middle of nowhere in western Belarus, and I really got into trying to commune with him. People are always asked, who is the one person in world history you would like to have had sit down and have a cup of coffee with? In my case, it would have been my grandfather, Soloveitchik, because he was one of the original labor Zionists. Poltava was a hotbed of labor Zionism. Some of you know your Israeli history. Yitzhak Ben Zvi, who was the second president of Israel, came from Poltava. Ber Baruchov, the ideologue of the labor Zionist movement, came from Poltava. And my grandfather's place on Pushkinskaya Street, which I visited, 67 Pushkinskaya Street. We actually have the address because my grandfather wrote a postcard to my mother when she was 2 as a keepsake from the Zionist Congress of 1911 in Basel, Switzerland. And so before I went to Belarus in 2004, I said, I know her address because it's in the book that my parents compiled about my grandfather. There's a copy of that postcard. And sure enough, there it was. And so he was also a gifted scientist. Didn't practice science, but he dabbled in it. Physics was his thing. He devised all kinds of things. Drew up a model for a helicopter. He'd never knew that Leonardo da Vinci had done that a couple of 300 years earlier. But he wanted to create this idea of an aircraft that could land and take off vertically, and he drew the schematics for it. He invented a lot of things on paper. Of course, he didn't have the resources to actually make them happen. So he's a very interesting guy, and I won't tell you the rest of the story about him because I don't want to spoil the chapter. But it's a very inspiring as well as a very tragic story of my grandfather, my grandmother, my mother coming here, and what transpired after that. My paternal grandparents, about whom I know less because they left no writings, and everybody who knew them either perished in the Holocaust or died in exile somewhere in Siberia. So we don't know a whole lot about them. But I do know that my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was a descendant of the Rabbi Lev Yitzchak of Berditchev. So I come from pretty good stock, and very proud of it. The reason I got involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, or people always ask me, why did you get involved in the Soviet Jewry movement? What interested you in it? And again, this is a history book, and it's not just about me, it's about the period and the context in which a lot of things happened. The 1960s were a period of social activism, social turmoil in this country. There were a slew of causes that one high school or college kid could get involved in. And I didn't need to compete with everybody fighting the war. I participated in the anti-war movement. I marched against the war. But I wasn't a leader in that movement. But there was a vacuum when it came to the issue of Soviet Jewry in the mid to late 60s. It was not an issue that the Jewish community really embraced or understood. I got my first dose of the Soviet Jewry business in my bar mitzvah. I got 24 telegrams from all over the country and from Israel. Mazel tov on your bar mitzvah. Congratulations on your bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah, bar mitzvah, bar mitzvah. And then there was this telegram from my aunts in Kharkiv in Ukraine. and it said, "Congratulations on your birthday." So I said to my dad, I mean, what's this with the birthday stuff? I mean, everybody says bar mitzvah. This is not just a birthday. I mean, you've been telling me this. I'm now a man, you know. And he explained to me that if they had put bar mitzvah in the telegram, first of all, it probably wouldn't have got sent. And secondly, they probably would have been visited by the KGB or worse. And so they didn't take any risks. And as a 13-year-old kid, that kind of made an impression on me. When I went to the Soviet Union the first time in 1968, I was a sophomore in college to visit I have my back to you, I'm sorry. And I made my first trip to the Soviet Union to visit my relatives, my two aunts, and cousins in Moscow as well. And my older aunt, met me in Moscow. I recognized her at the airport immediately because she looked just like my dad, had the same nose features. And the Yiddish mama that she was my tour guide all over Moscow. And we got into the middle of Red Square, which is a pretty big place. And I decided that would be the time to ask her, what's life like for Jews in the Soviet Union? And she said, "Shh, the walls have ears." And first of all, I'd never heard that phrase before. Second of all, what walls? It's 100 yards away. Well, they have directional mics. And maybe they did have directional mics in those days, but they couldn't pave their streets, so I'm not sure they had directional mics that could listen to you from 100 yards away. Anyway, the point is that she was concerned enough not to want to talk about it, and we did most of our sensitive talking on a magic slate. Those of you who've been to the Soviet Union on trips in the past and you met with refuseniks, or you didn't talk because you assumed that everything was being bugged. So when you wanted to write, to say something or communicate something that was sensitive, you would put it on the magic slate, which is a cellophane thing. You write on it and then you rip it up. You take it and separate it from the cardboard, and it erases it automatically. Everybody went to Russia with a magic slate, and that's how we communicated. And that got me focused on the Soviet Jewry movement. And when I came home, I made a commitment to starting a student movement on campus at UCLA, and then we connected them to other campuses around California and ultimately around the country. And that became my passion for the following 7 or 8 years. Got to the point where my doctoral advisor, Professor John S. Galbraith, not the economist, but the British imperial historian, the day after my picture appeared in the LA Times, being led in handcuffs out of the Shrine Auditorium because we were arrested for disturbing the peace. By the way, the charges were dropped because there was no disturbance of the peace. As hard as we tried to disturb the peace, we weren't able to do it. My picture appeared in handcuffs on page 3 of the Sunday Times. And my professor on Monday asked me to come see him, and he said, "Mr. Yaroslavsky, when are your academic pursuits going to take as much of your time as your extracurricular activities?" And at that point in my life, I realized I'm getting out of here. I can't spend the rest of my life in a library studying the British colonial minutes, and I'm, there's a world out there to save, and that's what I proceeded to do. So for several years, I ran the Council for Soviet Jews here in LA, and then the city council seat opened up, and that I won't tell you the whole story. There's a good chapter about that. I got involved in. I'm a believer. Ralph Resnick and I, and where's the woman from Marcy from Michigan? They used to tell us in our discussion groups there are 2 ways to teach somebody how to swim. One is to take them, put floaters on their arms and carefully take them through the steps of swimming, and the other way is to just throw them in the pool and see if they sink or swim. And if they sink, you come in and you help them out. I was of the philosophy: you throw somebody in the pool, and I was going to throw myself in the pool. So from the first week or month that I was there, I got involved in issues, usually issues that other people didn't get involved in, or that were too controversial or not politically correct, and I took them on. One of them was the Olympic Games. To go up against the entire city establishment. This is the 1984 Olympics, which were a great thing. The bid for the games were in 1978. You bid 6 years at that time ahead of time. We were the only bidder for the 1984 Olympic Games. Tehran was the other bidder, and they had a minor issue in Tehran at that particular time, so they were taken out of the revolution, kind of put them out of the running, and but 2 years before 78, 1976 Olympics was Montreal. Montreal went broke, almost went broke. They ended up with a $500 million, $500 million in 1976 dollars, because they overspent and they didn't make enough money on it to balance their budget. And we were going through an entire tax revolution here, Proposition 13, and the notion that we would spend taxpayer money on the Olympic Games was an anathema to me and to my colleague Bob Ronka, who was really more responsible than I was for this, and has never been acknowledged by anybody. So one of the reasons I wrote that chapter on the Olympics, aside from the fact that you're reading the inside story of that bid issue, of how we got to the point where we prohibited the city from spending money. You don't read about that in any of the books that have been written about the Olympics, but you read it in I think it's chapter 8 of my book, and it's a huge deal because when we finally got the mayor and the rest of the city council to agree to put a tax ban in the city charter, which is a vote of the people, which the people, of course, overwhelmingly approved. It forced the city to turn the games over to a private company, but a private nonprofit organization, which was set up. And Peter Uberoth, you all remember that name? Nobody ever heard of Peter Uberoth in 1978, but he was hired in 1979. And there wouldn't have been a Peter Uberoth but for Bob Ronka, my colleague, who made it his mission to prevent the city from spending taxpayer money. Because if the city had been allowed to spend taxpayer money, they would have financed the whole games, and that would have been impossible to sustain. And so I got in the middle of all of these fights. I took on the LAPD. I ask my students these days, and I always ask myself, what issue am I willing to lose my job over? What issue am I willing to lose an election over? And I've said that to my students. If you can't answer that question, look at yourself in the mirror and ask that question. If you can't answer it, don't go into public service, because you'll be at the mercy of special interests, powerful interests, and you will not be serving the public at all. My red line when it came to issues was the First Amendment of our Constitution. You know, we're sworn to uphold the Constitution. Every person who assumes office in this country has to take an oath to uphold, to protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That includes the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the Constitution's the Constitution. The first article of the Bill of Rights is freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Basically, keep the government out of your life. The government has no business endorsing a religion. The government has no business conducting surveillance on rabbis, on ministers, on politicians, which they did, the LAPD did. Nobody took them on at that time. And I was advised, don't you take them on. The police department has a lot of ways they can get back at you. And you'll read in that chapter some of the ways they tried. But I said, after you've played hide and seek with the KGB in Moscow, the LAPD is not very intimidating. And as a result of the efforts that I made, and several of my colleagues too, but as a white politician on the city council, the only white politician who really was willing to overtly, frontally take on the chief of police over the abuses that we had, not just surveillance, but excessive use of force. We banned the chokehold in 1982. They're still wrestling with it in New York, in Missouri, and in Tennessee, in Minnesota. They're still wrestling with it now. But we banned it in 1982 because we had courageous elected officials and a courageous mayor at that time who made it their business to change the trajectory of the LAPD. So that was another one I got into. And then there's the county business, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. I'll leave the question you told me that interested you. You should ask me that question. I won't take the time to do it now. But overall, my message in this book was really to inspire people, especially young people who are thinking of going into public service, that it's a great calling. There is no greater calling in a democracy than to be in public service. It's hard. It's very difficult. You have to take a lot of criticism. You've got to take risks, and sometimes when you take risks, you fail. And sometimes when you take risks, you hit the jackpot. But as I tell my young students who've never heard of Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, I say Wayne Gretzky did not make 100% of the shots he never took. So if you want to just be there letting moss grow on your derriere, then don't do anything. Just be cautious. But you're not earning your salary, and that's my message: is you come into the public sector, either as an elected official or as a staff person, and push the envelope. Keep your eyes open. By the way, one of the things that I encourage all elected officials to do is to travel, especially outside the country, not on vacation, but to see. First of all, this is a city with 150 different languages. Every country on the planet is represented in this city. There is no other city like it in the world. You owe it to yourself to understand where these folks came from and why, and what makes them tick when they get here. Just like it's important for them to know what makes you tick. And one of the great experiences I had as a public official was starting in 1991. I was asked to help monitor elections in the new democracies in Eastern and Central Europe, and especially in the former Soviet Union. I didn't do a very good job in the former Soviet Union monitoring the elections, but I monitored the Ukraine election in 2004. I conducted seminars on local government to newly elected city council members in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Moscow and Kiev. And every time I made one of these very brief trips, 5-6 days, I came back enriched by it. And I learned, as my dad used to say, he learned more from his students than the students learned from him. I've come to now believe that that's true. I never believed them at the time. I learned more from those folks who were just starting to tiptoe into the democracy field with great courage, and I learned a lot from them. I learned a lot about what we take for granted here. Of course, we're not taking it for granted so much anymore here. But in 2004, we thought we had a pretty good democracy going. I've declined to do more democratization work at the moment because I think we need more work on our democracy than they do in some other places around the world. So I've had this great arc of exceptional parents. Even though my mother died when I was 10, she had a great influence on me. My grandfather had a great influence on me, even though he died 8 years before I was born, thanks to his writings and the stories that I've heard from people who were his contemporaries over the years. I grew up in Boyle Heights, as so many, maybe some of you did too. I still go back to Boyle Heights. It was a great community to grow up in. My parents were Hebrew teachers. I spoke Hebrew at home. I still speak fluent Hebrew. I couldn't campaign for office in Israel. I don't know enough Hebrew for that, but I can get directions. And my sister and I both spoke Hebrew at home. That was our first language. And my sister ultimately made Aliyah when she graduated high school, and she's lived there ever since in Haifa. So it's been a great ride, and I'm thrilled to be able to share the story with readers. The book has been extraordinarily well received, which is a relief because you never know how people are going to react to the book. But it's been very well received, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. So with that, let me turn it back over to Rabbi Sherman.
Thank you. So the highest I got in public office was 6th grade in my Hebrew day school, and it was co-president because we tied. But I went to a different type of public service. You mentioned this sort of path of Judaism, Russian refuseniks, Los Angeles, Hebrew, Israel, and then you have this civic side of Los Angeles, United States, and this nation. Do those intersect? Did they ever intersect in a way that you had to separate them? How did this life of Zev Yaroslavsky, the American Jew as a Ukrainian grandchild, intersect with the American dream?
Yeah, good question. I'm asked sometimes, did you ever experience anti-Semitism in all the years you were in public service? Not that I know of. There was one time in 1975 or 76 when I've actually found this in researching my book. There was an article in the LA Times. An old, failing octogenarian. Octogenarian isn't the problem. Failing was the problem. He was a Bible thumper from Kansas who came here and had a bigoted streak to him, made a disparaging remark about Jews in the hills. We were trying to protect the hills from overdevelopment, and he said, "Oh, those Jews just don't want people from the inner city to come live there." Okay, that was I had forgotten about that when I found that article, and I remembered it pretty quickly. But I never experienced anti-Semitism myself. Now, I wasn't in the rooms of the California Club. I don't know what they were saying in the back room, but I never let it bother me. I never worried about it. The one time that we had a major public issue, and some of you will remember this if you grew up in L.A., if you lived in L.A. in the last 20 years. In 2004, we were threatened with a lawsuit at the county. The county had its official seal had a cross on it. I don't know how many of you remember this controversy. And this is one of those cases where people would call me and say, your constituency doesn't agree with you on this. And by the way, we polled my constituency because I was curious to see where my third supervisorial district is 2 million people, where they were on this issue. And 2/3 of the people said they wanted to keep the cross on the seal, and 1/3 did not. And I made the very simple decision that if I lose my next election over this, so be it. I'm not going to bed at night worrying why I voted to do something that to keep a religious symbol had nothing to do with the cross. But there's a constitutional cases that have come down from the Supreme Court. Now that might change with this court, but for 150 years, you cannot use a religious symbol, the primary symbol of a religion, on any government seal because it implies an endorsement of that religion. Now, unless you want to put the seal of every religion, all 150 of them, on the seal, you're better off just not putting it on. And this goes back to when I was growing up in Boyle Heights. Some of you may remember that the city hall used to be lit during Christmas and Easter with a cross. They lit the building with a vertical and a horizontal lights, and it was this big cross. And from Boyle Heights, you could see it. We could see City Hall from our apartment. And I would ask my dad, "What's with the cross? Why don't they have a Star of David?" Of course, he didn't want to explain that there wasn't enough width to put. Bill and I had geometry together, so we can talk about the geometric limitations of City Hall. And we voted. The vote was 3-2. Now, I didn't really have the problem, the threat, as much as I was attacked miserably by the right wing shock jocks, the Bill O'Reillys and the Dennis Pragers, who I've known since the late '60s in the Soviet Jewry movement. Dennis Prager called for my recall on national radio because I voted to take the cross off the county seal, and so two of my other colleagues, Gloria Molina, may she rest in peace, she just passed away, and Yvonne Burke, they really took it from their constituents because they understand why their constituents understood why the perfidious Jew would want to take the cross off the county. After all, he's a Jew, he's not a Christian. But you, the two of you, are Christians. You're traitors to your own kind. And that was really a profile in courage for those two to stand with the Constitution. Our lawyers told us, if you don't take the cross off and we get sued, we will lose. Any lawyers in the room? It's very unusual for a lawyer to say you will lose. It's usually, on the one hand, but on the other hand, one of my colleagues used to say, I wish I could find a lawyer that had just one hand. So that was the, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism that came through. Can I tell you a quick story about that? I love vignettes. my secretaries in the front of the receptionists who were taking all these calls, and by the way, the calls were, you couldn't get a phone call through into my office because all of these national radio broadcasters were saying, call these people's offices. And I knew when Bill O'Reilly was off the air because at 12 o'clock noon, all of a sudden, the phones weren't ringing anymore. And then at 1 o'clock, there it came again. My secretary comes in and she says, the women up in the front are having a real hard time. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm sure they are. I can see the number of phone lines that are lit up. I said, you know what, I feel like I want to go up and answer the phones myself with them. And they said, no, it's not the problem with the volume of the calls. They don't agree with your position. And I said, oh, that's a problem. So I said, I'm going to go up there. And I sat for the whole day. I took in phone calls and explained why we're doing it, the Constitution, all that stuff. They overheard all of it. But the first call I got was from an Armenian woman, an Armenian Christian woman in the Valley, when I represented the Valley. And she said, I said, Supervisor Yaroslavsky's office, can I help you? She says, yeah, I want to talk to the supervisor. I said, well, this is him. And she said, no, I want to talk to Mr. Yaroslavsky. I said, this is Zev Yaroslavsky. You're him? I said, yes, I am. You don't recognize my voice? And she says, well, before I tell you what I called about, I had your mother as a Hebrew teacher at LA City College in 1955. And by the way, this is not an unusual story. The wonderful thing about my mother, especially, both my parents were great teachers, but my mother was one of if you had three great teachers, she'd be one of them. She'd be on the top of everybody's list. And probably because she was an easy grader, among other things. But she told me that, and then I said, that's fantastic. Why would an Armenian Christian study Hebrew? I figured she's going to tell me she wants to study the scripture in the original language. Well, she says, I was raised on Armenian at home, and I wanted to learn another complicated language. So all of a sudden, the edge in her voice just dissipated. And she says, I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I called about this cross thing, and so don't apologize for it. Let me explain why we're doing it. Anyway, thing was over. 5 o'clock, the phone stopped ringing. I go back into my office, and my secretary comes to me, and she says, the girls really appreciated your being up there all day. And I said, yeah, man, it's hard. It's hard to take those incoming calls. And she says, no. They now understand your position, and they agree with it. And I said, well, that made my day. Anyway, yeah, even in your own office, you can't take things for granted.
So you mentioned the red line for you was free speech, and I'm wondering about the distinction between free speech and hate speech, in particular with today, as you retired in 2014, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and where that draws a line between free speech and hate speech in this country, as we as Jews are dealing with the difficult situation in Israel and figuring that balance out.
Well, it's a problem. I am a free speech hawk. I am a First Amendment hawk. I do believe you err on the side of free speech. That doesn't mean you agree with it. The old line is the best way to counteract hate speech is more speech, and we tend to get into a fetal position sometimes. I will tell you. Let me tell you what the consequences of hate can be. Hate speech can be. Donald Trump's speech and his cronies' speeches on January 6th, where they were encouraging people to engage in violence. I mean, there's no other way you can look at this, even if you like Trump. It was, if you remember, even Mitch McConnell, and the Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the day after the day after the impeachment thing was over in January of 2021, they blasted him for what he did, and that he should be accountable for it. Of course, they've forgotten that now, but that's another story. But the consequences of hate, and I'll tell you another consequence of hate speech, and this won't make me popular with some people here. When Bibi Netanyahu in 1995 was basically calling Yitzhak Rabin a traitor, and in any country, what do you do with a traitor? You string him up, and especially in the Middle East, and he inflamed the population so much that one guy, whose name I will not mention, who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, was motivated to do it. and said he was encouraged by rabbis to do it, by extreme rabbis. So hate speech is not just anti-Jewish hate speech. Sometimes we engage in hate speech. But the way, and when it comes to anti-Zionism, I have no tolerance for people who make the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In my opinion, you know my DNA. My grandfather was a labor Zionist delegate to the Zionist International Zionist Congresses at the turn of the last century. I'm a Zionist. You attack Zionism. We used to, those of us who were students, Ralphie, in our day, Bill, I'll use the language of the progressive movement of the 60s. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That's what it is. And the reason that there are academics now who say that the Israelis ought to be stopped from doing archaeological exploration in Israel is because they don't want the Israelis to prove that there is they've already proved it enough, that there is a connection between Jews and Israel, that we are descendants of, the Jewish people are descendant from that period of time. And there are people who just, the PLA for the longest time, the Palestinian Authority, has been trying to deny the connection between Jews and the land of Israel. And on campus, where I am and have been for the last 8.5 years, this is what you hear from academics, that Israel is a European neocolonialist state. That's nonsense. I mean, a colonialist state is Britain going into South Africa. There's no connection between Britain and South Africa. There's no connection between Britain and Nigeria, or Britain and Argentina, or the Congo, Belgium and the Congo. This was total exploitation. The Zionists, the Zionist movement is a movement of people who lost their homeland, who were expelled from their homeland, are going back to reclaim their homeland. Now, I'm not going to tell you it wasn't messy, and that it isn't messy, and there are issues that we need to deal with. But to say that when you attack Zionism, you're attacking my identity as a Jew. Not every Jew is a Zionist. Fine. So go somewhere else. But the overwhelming majority of Jews, young, old, and middle-aged, believe in Israel, believe in Zionism, believe that Israel is a Jewish state. Doesn't mean you have to go live there. But don't attack my homeland. I mean, is there any question about when you talk to an Irish person in New York or here that Ireland is not their homeland? Yeah, you just. So I'm really a hawk on this, and one of the things that I've tried to move the dial a little bit on campus with some of the leadership there is not to be afraid to say, yeah, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It is what it is. I mean, what more do you need? What more proof do you need? You want to attack Bibi? Go ahead. There's plenty to attack him on. You want to attack policies? Attack him. That's fair game. That's the kind of free speech. But when you start, and on campuses, you're not allowed to attack somebody's identity. You have the free speech to do it, but there are consequences to attacking somebody's identity, racially, ethnically, religiously. This is attacking my identity. All right.
Oh, thank you. You also speak about racial tensions within the city specifically. Just a couple of years ago with George Floyd, and it bled into what happened even in the streets here in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills. Maybe take us back to those days of Rodney King, and has anything changed? I know even right here on Martin Luther King weekend, we do a beautiful Unity Shabbat, but often it's one thing and not necessarily an extended relationship. Where I grew up in upstate New York, it was actually the playing fields where I met others that were not like me, and here it's a city where even some of our own children maybe have not met somebody of another colored skin. What did that look like when you got into office? And now that you have left office, what work do I have to do for our own community and our children?
Well, we have a lot of work to do, but we've come a long way too. And the most encouraging thing is that the younger generation, the 20 to 39-year-olds, have less of an issue with race, ethnicity than the older generation. The fact is, we live in what has been historically a segregated city. The west side is predominantly white. The south side used to be white, is now predominantly Latino. It used to be black. Now it's predominantly Latino. The valley, the flatlands of the valley is predominantly Latino. The hills around the valley are predominantly white. This is a segregated city, and it didn't happen by accident. This was fostered by federal policies that go back to the 1930s, where money was lent. It was hard to get money to buy a house in an area that the federal government said was a high-risk area. They called it redlining. We call it now redlining. If you look at a map of the city based on what the Federal Housing Authority, whatever it was called in those days, FHA, they would color the areas in different colors. Blue, like Bel Air, was really good investment quality. Westwood was green, second best, but Boyle Heights, red. And it was very difficult to get loans to buy homes in places like Boyle Heights or Watts or South Los Angeles, other parts of South Los Angeles. And over a period of time, think about this for a second. Your entire wealth, my entire wealth, what I'm worth, is largely tied up in my house. Whatever my house is worth, it's the bulk of my net worth. I'm lucky. I was able to buy a house, 1976. I still live in the same house. Better to be lucky than smart, inflation, real estate inflation. But nonetheless, people who couldn't buy homes were either redlined, or there were restrictive covenants, which also sometimes included Jews. Places like Hancock Park, Bel Air, Jews were not welcome there. Those folks who weren't able to get in on the real estate, on the home buying business, their net worth is a fraction, literally a fraction, 10% of what the average white family net worth is in this country. And there have been books written about this extensively. So I say that not that we can roll the clock back, but to understand that we have some racial disparities, and freeways were built in minority communities, not in the West Side, except for the 405. And I remember when they were building that, we used to play out there. But most of the Boyle Heights is now an asterisk. There are 5 freeways that cut through Boyle Heights. People who lived in Beverly Hills were able to stop the Beverly Hills Freeway. They had the political muscle to stop it. But the Boyle Heights has 5 freeways, and so they're more likely to get cancer from the emissions of the cars. They live in more dense conditions, so during COVID, they were more likely to get COVID. They didn't have health insurance to the same extent as the rest of us do, so as a result, they were more likely to die. I mean, the numbers don't lie, and those are things that we have to be cognizant of. Now, I say the young people, the younger generation, is wise to this, and there's been a lot of change. People, I do a survey every year at UCLA, a quality of life survey, countywide, and what the highest rated category among the 9 categories we rate everything that you would think of: healthcare, education, cost of living, traffic. And one of the things we rate is race relations and relations between the religions. That has always been the highest rated category in terms of satisfaction. I don't think it's true that race relations is that good, but I think it's an aspirational. People want this town to be more, fraternal, and African Americans are, markedly less satisfied with relations between the races, and especially between the LAPD and them, but they still have a very high view of race relations as a. So I tell you this because we did a vignette in one of our surveys, in early surveys. We interviewed people who responded to our surveys. The newspapers sometimes do that. They went, "Why did you say this?" So we asked about immigration back in 2016, 2017. do you think we should deport all illegal aliens or something to that effect? And there was a 57-year-old white woman in Manhattan Beach who said, no, shouldn't deport them. That got on our radar screens. We wanted to call her because 57-year-old in Manhattan Beach, 25 years ago would have probably said, send them back on the next bus. And then there was a guy in a white 30-year-old, give or take, in the San Gabriel Valley who also said, no, shouldn't deport them. So we interviewed the two of them. The woman in Manhattan Beach, when we asked her why she didn't believe they should be sent back, she says, well, we have quite a few immigrants in our school, Manhattan schools. Their parents are on the PTA. Their kids are good kids. I don't want to see them uprooted and sent back to their home. Jim Newton, who is the former editor of the editorial pages of the LA Times, and he covered me for many years, is now teaching at the Luskin School. And I said to him, a 57-year-old white woman in 1975 would have said, send them out. No tolerance at all. So that was one. What about the white guy in the San Gabriel Valley? He says, my girlfriend is a Latina. Her mother is undocumented and she lives with us. They're threatening to deport all. This is when Trump was threatening to deport everybody. If they deport my mother-in-law to be my girlfriend's mother, she's going to go to back to Mexico with her mother, and my relationship with her is done. So no, I don't want my future mother-in-law to be deported, which is kind of a small way of saying this is a much more integrated society now. People work in a workplace where there are people of all stripes working. People are intermarrying. Blacks are marrying Latinos. Whites are marrying blacks. Whites are marrying Latinas. I don't mean to leave out Asian Pacific Islanders. It's all over the place. And so there's this integration, social integration that wasn't in evidence 50 years ago or 30 years ago. That's changing the landscape a lot. But we still have a lot of work to do. I can tell you that today I saw an email that was sent by somebody. I won't say even what the issue was, but what the anti-Semitism and the anti-black and the anti-gay vitriol that came out of a very prominent person's email. I'm shocked that person would even put it in an email. I mean, I have no interest in making that person's life any more miserable, but it was shocking. Sometimes that's why I say you never know what's being said in the back room at the country clubs, right? So, but I think we've made a lot of progress. But don't underestimate the. We have to appreciate exactly how young black men, especially, feel when they go out at night. This is not a slogan. It's not a talking point. I've seen it with I used to ride with the police all the time when I was on the council. I saw the way they treated blacks. They don't treat them with respect. They don't treat them the same way they treat young whites. I remember driving right here on Wilshire Boulevard going home from school, from UCLA. It was raining. I had a raincoat on. My taillight was out. I was pulled over by a cop. He walked over. I got out of the car. I had my hands in my pockets of my raincoat. I was 19 years old. I didn't know anything about protocol here. And he said, sir, if I can ask you to please slowly take your hands out of your pockets. Okay. Sir, the reason I told you, I asked you to take your hands out of your pocket is because, we don't know whether you have a gun and it could be problematic. Okay. Sir, this, sir, that. I'm going to give you a warning. Go get your light fixed tomorrow and you'll be okay. If I had been a young 19-year-old black driving on Wilshire Boulevard in 1969, I wouldn't have been called sir. I would have been proned out on the hood of my car. I mean, this was standard operating procedure. And there's a lot of scar tissue that is left on that. And we need to appreciate that and understand why there's such a rawness when it comes to police-community relations. It's tough, but we've come a long way.
So one last question and one personal question at the end. the question that I asked you before, the difference between being a city council member and being a county supervisor. You write in this book, it was very striking to read this, that, I mean, you mentioned the phone calls that were coming in. You were directly speaking to people, but as a county supervisor, you're really speaking to no one, but representing everyone that doesn't have the chance to actually call you personally to improve their lives. At what moment did you realize that you were working for no one, but in fact everyone? And
so that's a really good story, and I'm impressed that you caught that, because it
had a long flight from Israel last week, so it was lots of reading.
It was an eye opener for me, because I had no idea what the Board of Supervisors was like, what the culture of the place was. I knew the issues they dealt with, and I knew I wanted to be dealing with those issues, but I didn't know how the place functioned. In the city hall, first of all, I had 225,000 constituents. In the county, I had 2 million constituents. It's a big difference. If I alienate 100,000 constituents in the county, I still have 1.9 million people to fall back on. If I alienate 100,000 people in my council district, I'm done. So politically, there's a difference. But more importantly than that, is that the city deals with middle-class issues, or what we used to call the middle-class issues: tree trimming, street paving, crime, parks and recreation, libraries. And when you represent West Los Angeles and Sherman Oaks, which I represented, they know how to get to you. They call you. They know somebody who knows you, and they call you, and they're calling you all the time. Our phones never stopped ringing off the hook when I was in the city council. I come to the county December 5th, 1994, and the phones aren't ringing. And my first reaction is there must be something wrong with the phone system, because we're not getting any calls. And this went on for a whole, several months. And the difference is that the city council is basically a legislative job. It's not really a legislative job, but it's a mini executive job where you legislate. You have a responsibility for your district, but you're not the only one with responsibility. You got a mayor, you got a planning commission, you got a police commission, you got neighborhood councils now. I mean, it's a mishmash of stuff. At the county, you're it. There are 5 people who govern the county. There is no elected mayor. 5 people govern the county. We each represent 2 million people. The first thing I noticed in the Hall of Administration, I knew this before because I used to go there to meet with my supervisor, Ed Edelman, is you can't just get into the 8th floor office suites. There's a guard there. You have to be on the list. It's like going into the White House. You have to be pre-cleared.
Like coming to Sinai Temple.
Well, sort of like coming to Sinai Temple, except that they didn't ask for my name when I came in. They just wanted to make sure I didn't have any contraband on me. At the county, you have to have your name, who you're going to see. It's a terrible thing. You can walk down the hall at the County Hall of Administration and hear the echoes of your feet all the way down the hall. The hall is about an eighth of a mile long. It's a horrible way to do business, especially when you're used to. I used to compare it like this. I used to say it felt like I ran the most successful store in the chain for 20 years, and I did such a great job. They promoted me to the vice president of sales in Simi Valley. All of a sudden, I don't see anybody. Nobody calls. And so one day, there was an issue. I don't remember what the issue was, but I said to my chief of staff, also a labor Zionist from Habonim, Elisa Katz, and I said, we ought to have a hearing on this, whatever this was. And she says, you don't have to have a hearing. You're a supervisor. You're in charge. Just fix it. You don't have to have a hearing. You don't have to do anything. Just do it. And that was kind of the light bulb moment where I realized that I was an executive now, not a legislator. That we were going to have to go out and find our constituents who need help. They're not going to come to us because they're poor. They work all day. Some of them work 2 or 3 jobs. The woman who cleaned the offices the janitor who cleaned the offices on the 8th floor, this was her second job. She was coming to work when I was going home to my kids. That's why I got so involved with the Justice for Janitors movement, to give them a living wage. And some of our own members of this temple and other temples who own a lot of buildings didn't want to pay them a living wage. They said, I said, I'm sorry, these were some of my supporters. I said, you can't do this. You will be judged when you get to the gates of upstairs. You're going to be judged on how you treated the least among us. You're not giving them a minimum wage because they're undocumented, and you can get away with not doing it because they won't complain about you. Well, they're complaining to me, and I'm telling you, you're going to have some business before the county, before the city. You want me to look on you favorably? You're going to have to treat these folks with respect. And the Justice for Janitors movement's one of the proudest things I've ever been involved in. They thank me all the time for it. Even to this day, I said, "Don't thank me. I thank you for giving me purpose." So many things you do in public life is bureaucratic. It's budgets. It's this. It's that. Raise taxes. Lower taxes. I said, this actually made me feel like I was making a difference in somebody's life. And when I used to ride around with the LAPD, I used to go into the communities of Westlake, Pico Union, where 2-bedroom houses weren't 2-bedroom houses. They were 5-bedroom houses because every closet was a bedroom. The kids would sleep in the closets. And so when I saw Alma, my janitor on the 8th floor, every night when she came in, that's what I was thinking about. So when I became a county supervisor, I told my chief of staff, I said, they're not going to come to us. First of all, they're busy and they're working and all that. Second of all, they can't spell Yaroslavsky. So they'll never even get my number from information. So we're going to have to go out, and we know where the poor people are in our district, where the lower income people part, mainly the flatlands of the San Fernando Valley and parts of Hollywood. We have a huge people think the West Side, that my old supervisor district was all rich people. Bel Air, Holmby Hills. No. It's Van Nuys. It's North Hollywood. It's Arleta. It's Sun Valley. It's Canoga Park. It's Reseda. These are salt of the earth people who work hard for a living, and when they call you, they deserve to be treated with respect. My long held axiom: if you treat people with respect, they will reciprocate. If you treat people with contempt, they'll reciprocate that way too. It's a lot easier. As I was telling somebody recently, it's the old Jewish saying: you draw bees with honey, not with vinegar. And anyway, so that was the moment, the aha moment for me. Okay.
So my last question before we open it up to conversation.
All right.
One person that you could not do this without was your beloved wife, Barbara, of blessed memory, and you speak about her own election and how that turned out. But literally, you're beshert, and even though she's not physically present with us, I know her presence is still felt. And what was her role in your success in all of this?
Yeah, my wife and I, it was. I mean, it's a trite saying, but it was love at first sight. She worked the switchboard. She was a switchboard operator at the University of Judaism on Sunset Boulevard on Sunday mornings, and I was the shomer for LA Hebrew High School. They hired me to be kind of the gopher and to monitor the exits because they knew that I knew all the tricks of how to play hooky, so they hired me. And one day I'm down at the lobby where the switchboard is, and I saw this gorgeous woman with this gorgeous smile and these beautiful blue eyes, and I asked her out on a date, and that was it. And we never dated anybody else. We were together for 51 years, 47 of them married, but it wasn't that long of an engagement. But my dad had moved to Israel, and he didn't want to make him come back for 2 years after. He wasn't very wealthy, and to come back for the wedding a year later after he moved to Israel. So we postponed the wedding for a couple of years, and he came back. She was pivotal to my life. I mean, she's those of you who knew her don't need to be told. The best way I can describe her, I describe it in the book. There was a great story, great interview that Larry King did with Bob Strauss. Bob Strauss was the former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He was Carter's ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was a big influencer, lobbyist in Washington. And he's interviewing him, and he says, Bob, describe Bob Strauss to the American people. And Strauss said, well, Larry, Strauss was from Texas. He said, well, Larry, he says, More people know the Pope than know Bob Strauss, but Bob Strauss knows more people than the Pope does. And that's, if there's one sentence that describes Barbara, is more people knew me than I knew them. But Barbara knew more people than I did, and she knew everybody. She knew who was sleeping with whom. God help me if I strayed, it would be in her antenna right away. She was an incredible woman, resilient as all heck. I'm sorry. Sanctuary. She was extraordinarily resilient. She had this capacity to bring more and more people into her orbit without losing the people who were already in her orbit. And the other best thing I can say is that when she died, her funeral was the day before New Year's Eve, it was December 30th. And I arrived, I planned to arrive at the Temple Israel, where the funeral was, on, it was called for 11 o'clock. We were going to get there at 10:20. And at 10:15, there was a traffic jam that was a quarter of a mile long. There were 1,100 people who came to see her, to say their goodbye. And it basically filled up Temple Israel, and it was just unbelievable. And it was Barbara all the way around. It was Eli Broad over here, and our gardener over here. And I said at the funeral, I said that I know that most of you voted for me not because you wanted to vote for me, but because you didn't want Barbara to be married to an unemployed politician. And there's a lot of truth to that. She was very special, most giving person I knew. Thankfully, she was recognized by people in power for her own worth, and she was named to the California Medical Board. She was the first non-doctor to chair the Medical Board of California for 3 years. They all loved her. She read every single document that came. I know that because she was reading them at night in bed because she couldn't sleep because of her arthritic knees, and so forth. I miss her. But she's got a granddaughter who was born a year and a half after she died, who has her blue eyes and her reddish brown auburn hair and her curls. And every time I look at that little 3-year-old, she's almost 3. And she's named after her. Yael was her Hebrew name, and that's her name. And so it's you can't. Our lives were so intertwined that we were a whole that was bigger than the sum of its parts, is the best way I could put it. She was the bigger part of the whole, I can tell you that. Yeah, we miss her. Thanks for asking.
So we want to open
Questions,
up to
yeah.
questions. If you can just use the microphone for the recording so people can hear as well. Yes.
So I'm a teacher, and I'd be very interested in finding out from you how you think the students of today are compared to the students like at UCLA when you were going there.
Yeah. I haven't never thought of that. Look, I can tell you this not from UCLA. I can tell you this from hiring people at the city and county. The thing that, and it's at UCLA too. The thing that is most deficient is that people don't know how to write. They just can't write. I've actually had functionally illiterate people in my class. It happens, and I try not to be judgmental about it. But the one thing I've noticed for decades, this goes back decades, is that when we hired somebody, I made them write something. I'd give them something just random. Sit down, here's a pen, I want you to write a page about X, just to see if they can string 2 sentences together. Because if you can't write, you can't communicate. And with all due respect to social media and all that 44 characters business, that doesn't get you to where you need to go. You need to be able to articulate, in writing.
How about social consciousness?
Oh, I think, yes, I think they're, well, when I was there, Bill and I were Fairfax and at UCLA, the war made you pretty conscious. But it was a matter of self-preservation at the time. There is very intense social consciousness today, and it's not self-interest. I mean, you could argue it's, we're all better off if we all get along and we create more equity in our society, et cetera. But, the most interesting thing about our surveys, the people who are most anxiety-ridden over our quality of life right now are whites between the ages of 18 to 39. Not Latinos, not Asian Pacific Islanders. African Americans have a ways to go. But the whites have gone from this down to young whites. And part of it's the pandemic. They've not fully recovered economically from the pandemic. I'm not sure what all the reasons are, so there's a social consciousness that's being driven. You saw it in the George Floyd aftermath. I live near Beverly and La Brea. I live 2 doors south of Beverly. That was where the civil disturbance took place. The police were moving them east on Beverly from Fairfax, and they were destroying one out of every 4 buildings smashing the windows on 1 out of every 4 buildings, including Shaarei Tefillah Synagogue, which is where I go on the high holidays. It was ugly. Most of the people who were in those crowds were young whites. So it was kind of, and I was shocked by that visual. And then I said, why are you shocked? Your own survey shows this is exactly who's ticked off. So I think there is a social consciousness, and you're seeing it in the housing front. You're seeing it on, the old upper middle class whites are aging out. I'm 74 and a half years old. So there are people who are, community activists who think they represent the communities in which they live, who are out of touch with what's going on. Sometimes I'm out of touch with what's going on, but I'm big enough to say I'm out of touch and try to get my finger on the pulse. I was talking to one leader of one of the homeowner associations a few weeks ago at one of these book parties, and I said, the problem is, I'm 74 years old. You're older than I am, and you've been the head of that homeowners association for 35, 40 years since I was a councilman. Where's the bench? where's the leadership development? And the fact is that a lot of young people don't share the views of the older folks about housing. Cost of housing is out of sight. People can't amass enough money to put a down payment on a house in the lower priced areas of the city, let alone in the Beverly and La Brea, where my wife and I were able to save money. I saved money as a Hebrew school teacher, as she did, teaching confirmation classes. We were able to put together enough money to put a down payment down. Couldn't do that today. So anyway, I do think there's more social consciousness about those folks. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we'll go.
Since we dumped the buses come in, why can't we send some of the people to outlying areas, Barstow, Victorville, some of the Inland Empire? Why do they all have to congregate in L.A.? There's more space out in Alondo.
Yeah. So I don't know what the I don't know enough about. I don't know how many people have actually come here. I think it's a political ploy by the governors of Florida and Texas, and I don't want to opine on it. Well, I think they're sending them to other parts of California too. I don't know. I mean, why Los Angeles? I mean, because Ron DeSantis wants to make Governor Newsom's life miserable. What he thinks. Okay, I don't want to get into a debate about it because I don't have I don't really there aren't enough people to keep me up at night at this point in time. But I think there are efforts being made to take legal to take legal action to prevent this from happening. This is not good for the people that are being bused. There are a lot of legal issues there, constitutional issues, and let them work its way out. Okay, we'll go back there.
You move from political positions to a university. How did that change kind of your view, I guess, of life and the generations and politics?
So it's a sensitive subject because I'm still working there. So I love being at UCLA. I mean, I could have made a lot more money doing other things, and I wasn't going to do those other things. For the longest time, my dream was that when I left office, I'd like to be able to go back to my alma mater and teach. And I didn't make an effort to do it. Chancellor Block reached out to me, and we've become good friends. And it was my dream to come back to UCLA because I kind of felt, as I told you from the beginning, that I felt I kind of let Professor Galbraith down when I quit the doctoral program, and they put their faith in me. They thought I had potential, and then I just up and left. Now, Professor Galbraith understood. He said, "Good luck to you. I understand." So and he sent me a nice little note when I got elected. He said, "The British Empire's loss is Los Angeles' gain." And that note was framed next to my desk for all my years in office. But the one thing I did when I went to UCLA was I promised myself I would not try to change the place. I'm now an employee. I'm not in charge. And when people ask me, how do you like UCLA? I said, well, it's better to have the bureaucracy working for you than you working for the bureaucracy. And academia is a very bureaucratic place. And I wouldn't want the chancellor's job for all the money in the world. It's a terrible job. It's a shared governance. You got to deal with the academic senate, with the deans and all this other stuff. It's not my cup of tea. I like to have more authority. And it takes a special person to do that job. In terms of the two observations I'll make about the university, most of the students are fantastic, and they come. UCLA in particular has made an effort successfully to draw people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so, as I said, when my dad used to say, I learn more from my students than the students learn from me, I thought that was nonsense when I was growing up. I learned a lot from those kids. And let me tell you this, when something goes wrong with the computer in the classroom, I've got 15 kids who can come and fix it. I don't know, the escape from enter, they are smart, and especially the ones who transfer from community colleges into UCLA after 2 years in community college. These are the kids who really, they're not going to UCLA because it's a status symbol. They're going to UCLA because they've worked their way to get there. They pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. I've got students of mine who I am certain are homeless, who live out of their car. I had students who lived in not Blue Jay, but Lake Gregory, which is not far from Lake Arrowhead, and they arrange their schedule so that they go to school on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And they come in on Tuesday morning. They take their classes all day Tuesday night. They sleep in their car on Wednesday night. They take classes the rest of the Wednesday, and then they go back to Lake Gregory. This is a big problem, and the chancellor and the university has made a huge effort to build more housing for the students. I played a little role in that when I was a councilman. There's a section of the book on this. I'll tell you the story. Most of you live in this area, right? Westwood, West LA. So in 1989, the chancellor, Chuck Young, one of the great public administrators ever, put out a long-range development plan for the campus. It was going to build 4 million square feet of new buildings. The community had a fit around here. I mean, UCLA is the fourth largest employer in LA County. fourth largest employer, 60,000 people a day. A lot of cars. And we figured it would be another 50, 60,000 cars a day because of that expansion. And and we had no jurisdiction over UCLA because it's state property. So the city had no jurisdiction. I had no leverage. But I went to Chuck. We had a meeting, all hands meeting, and I said, and because he said we're not going to generate 60,000 cars a day. That's ridiculous. It wasn't ridiculous, but my traffic engineers tell me we're only going to generate 25,000 a day more than we have now. All right. So I said to him in the meeting with all hands meeting, I said, so if you think you're not going to exceed 25,000 after you build 4 million square feet of new building, then why don't we phase it 1 million at a time? You're not going to build all 4 million at the same time, so let's do the million, and then we'll count the trips that come, the vehicular trips that come in and out of the campus, because there are only a finite number of places where you can go in and out of the campus. We'll count the number of vehicular trips. If you haven't reached 25,000, we'll let you go to the next million, and if you don't, after the second million is occupied, we measure it by the way, continue to measure it to this day in October, the busiest month of the year. And as long as you don't exceed 25,000 in the aggregate over what it was in 1989, you can go until you get to 4 million and finish it. So he said in front of his people and my people, he said, we can live with that. And his traffic engineer said, Chancellor, you can't say that. I said, but you've been telling me for 6 months that we're not going to exceed 25,000. So let's put our money where our mouth is. And that was the end of that. That's leadership. Leadership starts at the top and works its way down. What did they do? They decided the way they were going to solve this problem was to add more housing to the campus. And they built thousands of new housing units. Of course, the neighborhood opposed most of it. They don't even know it's there now. But what did it do? They generate the same number of vehicular trips today, and even before the pandemic in 2019, than they did in 1989. They haven't increased it by 100. Sometimes it's 100 or 200 more, sometimes 100 or 200 less, not 25,000. How did they do that? They converted the UCLA from a commuter campus to a residential campus. So one of the things, I tell you that because of the housing crunch, that UCLA's goal is to give all of their undergraduates on campus or within 1 mile walking distance of the campus housing as part of their package when they come to UCLA, and it just goes to show you that sometimes, if you set a goal, whether it's the moonshot or whether it's housing at UCLA, you can actually do it if you put your mind to it. All right, Jimmy, you had a question. Where's Jimmy? Yeah, you had a question. Yeah. Thank you. It was an honor. Yeah. Yeah, there's an article I just read, I think it was in Haaretz, that said the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel goes overboard to ensure that everybody's treated equally, at least on paper. That's what it says. Just like our Constitution, in theory, that's what it says. He says the Declaration of Independence must be in hiding somewhere. It's in a vault. It's not like our Constitution, which you can go see at the National Archives. And they use that example as one. Look, what did they call the policy we have towards Taiwan is kind of strategic ambiguity, something like that. Ambiguity is the operative word. Sometimes it's best not. What's that? Right. You just there's sometimes less is more. Just don't say anything. And that particular thing, the sad thing about it, Jimmy, and we're having the same problem here. This isn't an Israeli problem. It's very much our own problem in terms of our politics. Why isn't there not one Republican in the Congress who has still in the Congress who can say anything critical about Donald Trump? Not one. Why not? Because if they do, he'll go after them, and that's the people who are critical, the people who voted for impeachment, who are Republican, all got defeated in the last election. It's the same thing in Israel. Why does Bibi have this crazy, incredibly unbelievable coalition where he has a bona fide terrorist who actually was in prison in Israel for inciting violence in his cabinet as a security minister? I mean, could you make this thing up? If you gave a script to a Hollywood producer, he wouldn't accept it. It wouldn't be realistic. Why does he do that? Because it's the only way he could keep himself out of jail. That's why. And the same thing with our former president. This is all about survival for him. It's not about principle. Ehud Olmert went to prison. He didn't try to for bribery. It happens. But he took it like a man. This guy is not my favorite. I'm sorry. I don't mean to offend anybody, but I think what's going on in Israel right now is a disaster. If you read the Israeli press, it's a security disaster for the country. All of his military people have been. He wouldn't meet with his chief of staff, his military chief of staff, before the vote. He just wouldn't return his call, because what the chief of staff was going to tell him is this is going to be a serious blow to our security, because who are the people who are not going? Who are the people who are leaving the reserves or not fulfilling the reserve obligations? It's not an obligation. This is voluntary reserves. These are the pilots who fly the most sophisticated planes they have. It's the people who are in intelligence. It's a disaster. And my sister lives there. All three of my nephews served in the IDF. One of them in combat. One of them in the Golani Brigade. So I think I have some license, and I'm not going to speak for them, but their views aren't much different than mine. But it's a situation where the politics creates strange bedfellows, right? Anyway, all right.
Anna?
You have a question?
Last word,
Last
our
one.
president.
Anna gets the last one.
Your daughter-in-law is a new city council.
Not president. It's bad enough. Yeah.
Can you share what she has sought from you?
Well, I don't give advice unless I'm asked. She once in a while she asks. But let me tell you something. I'm 74. She's 42 or 43. She's very smart, and she has a finger on the pulse of the district. She crushed her opposition in the election, and the reason was she had her. I know he is, and it's nothing personal, but it wasn't just him. It was in three other council districts where the people who were tied to the old guard got crushed, and the people, some of them far left, and some of them like her. She's a progressive. She's not a socialist. She's a progressive. And I remember this is during the campaign. She asked me to look at one of her campaign pieces, and I said, "Jesus, this is really progressive." And she says, "Zev, I am a progressive." I said, I plead guilty. Okay. And you know what? I had people my age telling me, I hate to be such an ageist, telling me, she shouldn't be saying that. She shouldn't be saying this. And then the returns came in the primary, and she almost won it in the primary. And I said, I've stopped giving her advice. She actually knows more about the district than I do. And she knew more about the district than a lot of people do. And this goes back to what I was saying. This is a changing city, folks. People want public safety. People want, a quality of life. Much of our quality of life has now been usurped by state government. Jimmy, you probably you haven't been in the city council for a while, but but the state has taken away much of the authority of cities to protect the quality of life in their cities. There's a massive homeless problem, and everybody's angry about it. And then when somebody tries to do something about it, everybody gets angry at them. And I think the mayor is doing an outstanding job in trying to wrest this issue, this homeless issue, and to take control of it. She spoke to my class in May of 2022, my public policy class. And as she was leaving the class, she asked me what I thought she should do about homelessness. And I said, I think you should find somebody, make them the czar, the homeless czar, give them authority, get the board of supervisors to agree. You guys all get together and agree. The first meeting you should have is go up to the hall of administration and meet with the board of supervisors. And so the first day she was in office, she announced that she was declaring a state of emergency on homelessness. And everybody said, well, what's that going to do? Well, in and of itself, it won't do a whole lot. It gives her a little more power here and there, but it doesn't really make a difference. What does make a difference is that by declaring the state of emergency, she made herself the czar. She said, I'm in charge. I'm putting the bullseye on my back. Hold me accountable for whether we can make a dent in the problem. No other mayor was willing to do that. Garcetti didn't do it. Antonio Villaraigosa didn't do it because, honestly, folks, we're not going to solve the homelessness problem very, very quickly. This is a problem that's been around for 100 years. It didn't happen overnight. It's not going to get solved overnight. So the politically right thing to do has been, don't get involved with that issue because you'll be associated with a failure. But it's now, my old friend Jonah Goldrich, and some of you knew Jonah. Jonah used to say, the trouble with you politicians is you're afraid to make a decision. And because he thinks you'll be criticized for the decision. And sometimes when you make no decision, he said, you'll end up getting criticized. And he's absolutely right. So the longer we defer making a difficult decision, the more difficult that decision will be when we inevitably have to make it. And so I think the mayor has done an outstanding job in taking the leadership. Now, can she produce? She asked me a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago, what would be the metric? The metric would be, of success would be if people walk out of their house and they say, things are better than it was a year ago. And I can tell you in my neighborhood, not my immediate neighborhood, but in my part of town, the biggest encampments have been removed, and they've been removed the right way. They've been given housing, and not just moved to another corner, and not paying somebody $100 to go into somebody else's district, which has been going on. You got to solve the problem, and it's not going to be done overnight. And just to close it out, I think there are a lot of good people in the city government now who want to do the right thing, and we ought to encourage them to do the right thing and to succeed, not to hope that they fail. And some people want the mayor to fail because they were for the other guy. They wanted we ought to be getting together. This is a major crisis, and it's an existential crisis to our society. You can't have a city like this or a country like this where you have tens of thousands of people who don't have a roof over their head. It's just unfathomable. But it's not going to get solved just by the city or the county. This is a national problem. The economic divide, the income divide is profound. And I'll close with this one statistic to give you some food for thought. I do my survey, I told you, every year. 38% of the households in LA County, the households, have incomes of less than $60,000 a year. 38%. So 1 in 4 people, households, not people. So if you have a household of, a husband and wife and 3 kids, you have the high end of that range is 60,000. 18% of all of the county's households make less than $30,000 a year in household income. So you do the math. You know how much an apartment costs. You know how much food costs. And by the way, they are the people who have been hurt hardest by COVID. They are the people whose incomes have not returned to what it was before COVID. So they're getting hit coming and going. They make less money than they did in 2020, and what they have doesn't buy as much as it did in 2020. And that's why we continue to see the growth. And this is not a Mayor Bass problem or a Katie Yaroslavsky problem or a Lindsay Horvath problem. This is a national problem. And until we deal with the income inequality, it's two sides of the equation. The cost of housing is too high. but the people's incomes are too low. Somewhere there's got to be a middle ground. All right. Thank you, Rabbi.
I want to thank Zev Yaroslavsky. If you have not gotten your book yet, please outside get Zev's Los Angeles, and thank you.